get started with the panel discussion.
Good afternoon. I'm Susan Burian, and I am on the board of I've been working for some years with the group. I'm also a retired preservation consultant. And we have here our speakers from today, and I think you probably know all of them. Art Miller here on my left from Lake Forest College. Stuart Cohen, our keynote speaker, author, architect. Nate Lielasus, architect, researcher, and writer. And Sullivan, architect, teacher, and of course Bill Tyre, who you all know, a researcher, writer, and major domo at Glessner House. So we've heard from each of these people. We've heard each of them speak about a different area of Howard Van Doren Shaw's work today in some detail. So we're going to wrap up the symposium with a kind of a discussion, a panel discussion about his impact on architecture and urban planning and the relevance of his work, what kind of relevance it still holds for us today. When Shaw won the gold medal in 1926, it was also stated that it was for his, quote, lasting influence on the theory and practice of architecture. So that's kind of what we're going to center our discussion on. What is his lasting influence? He did bring noted for bringing a European influence and a kind of eclecticism to the arts and crafts movement, which, as we all know, had nationally influence and provided, with the groups of young architects that he worked with, has provided a bridge to modernism. So it can be looked at in that kind of macro way. I was going to start with residential, but I think I'm going to put that aside for a moment. We will get back to Stuart. But I've been sitting here thinking about Marktown and Market Square and the relationship between them. And I'm struck by the fact that Marktown was very sectionalized and zoned. It had no, the parking was in one area, the residences were here, the park, was over here. The retail, I don't know if it ever got built. And that may have something to do with what has happened to it since, along with the fact that, its location. And then you have Market Square that is this totally integrated space. But so first I wanted to ask Nate, how do you think, what are the things from Marktown, lessons that are learned there or impacts that you think are important to know today?
Well, I do think it's interesting when you look at Marktown and the progressive era communities and you really look at the way that the areas are divided into different sections, as you mentioned with the residential. And I think when you're looking at a place like Marktown, it's important to think about the fact that Chicago didn't have a comprehensive zoning ordinance until the early 1920s. The same year, Marktown was really getting rolling was when New York City rolled out their famous zoning ordinance in 1916. So Shaw was definitely thinking about things that were on the cusp of the time and of how to zone these communities with residential and housing and parks.
I like the sort of mixed-use model of Market Square. And we see a lot of malls today that are in trouble. And so I'm wondering, could they be redesigned and reinvented to be more like Market Square, where you have this total mix of all kinds of activities in one? And
is Market Square profitable? It was taken over by a third owner in 2013, and he's completing some major changes on the second levels. I think the idea is that it will be profitable before too long. Putting in an elevator, which was something that could make a big difference on the second floor. So I think it was profitable in those days. I think it is intended to be profitable. Having things like Lululemon come in, so you can pay $50 for a T-shirt or something, you know, is, I think, aiming in that direction. They did make that right at the beginning, and they continued to make 3 to 4% into the 60s. And in the 60s, they wanted 5%, and so they changed managers and still got 4%. And that was, then they sold it.
Do you think that modern malls could be saved by doing some?
Yes and no. The first question that you ask, which is, you know, what's the influence of this, is that you can see the lessons of Market Square and to a lesser degree of Marktown in a movement which is called the New Urbanism, which is actually an idea about planning towns and smaller scale cities. And one of the dilemmas of the New Urbanism for all of the ideas it incorporates, which are, you know, locating things within walking distance and kind of suppressing automobile use except for going other places, is a kind of chicken and egg problem that they had with a development called Kentlands, which is that the designers, Dwani Platter Zybrek, insisted that the commercial component, that is the heart and center of the city, the market square, be there from the beginning, and the developers in some cases built these things and they failed. And they failed because they were dependent on the population of the community that had been built. So the retail and the town centers don't work until you have a certain population, which was a real dilemma for the New Urbanism. The regional shopping center, by being regional, solved that. They were a destination for a whole huge area, which was required to support that kind of retail. And the problem is that they are now failing because of demographic shifts. Could you rehab them and include, you know, take away the parking around the perimeter, do something else with it, put it underground, put it as it's called Kansas, the thing in Kansas City that parked the automobiles on the roofs. Could you incorporate housing and make them centers of whole communities? Yes, but they tend to be not where people really want to live anymore, which is another kind of dilemma.
But if they made them more of a mixed-use facility, people might want to live there. As you said, people now want to live and work and
you know,
shop
that's
and
certainly
eat
a lesson of
the
Market Square, except those were intended to be service apartments for people who worked in the community as opposed to homeowners. And I think, you know, yes, what you're pointing at is a lesson that we could learn from Shaw, but I think you've asked some more interesting, larger questions in terms of what we could learn from Shaw today that maybe people on the panel would like to address.
Yeah, and we have a couple of very large developments on the boards now in Chicago that where you brought that interesting point about it's like the chicken and the egg, which comes first. You know, you don't have the commercial until you have the people, and they need the commercial to make everything else work. So that's an interesting.
I don't want to seem like I'm dominating this, but I think the very first question which you asked and then ran away from it with the speed of light was what was the impact of Shaw? And clearly he had an enormous impact on his contemporaries. And then the influence that he had was completely washed away by modernism and by all of the histories and articles and magazines that wrote exclusively about modernism. So it's really not until well into the second half of the century when history becomes in the interest of architects once again that people are rediscovering Shaw. So his impact is interesting in that it's initial, and then it happens with the kind of reintroduction of a historical sense into not all architecture, but some architecture. And, you know, for me as a practicing residential architect, my interest in Shaw was to realize how inventive and imaginative and wonderful these buildings were. And ultimately, there was an English architect called Peter Smithson who practiced in the 60s and 70s. He was actually a new brutalist, and he was a big fan of the architect Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier's work came out every 10 years in a volume called the Oeuvre Complete. And Peter Smithson once said that he dreaded he waited and dreaded each new issue of the Oeuvre Complete because it was only to realize that someone else had his best ideas before him. And the more I build, the more I realize that Shaw has had all of my best ideas before me.
Is it your feeling that Shaw would have gone with the flow and become more of a modernist?
No.
Really? Well, because he did it. Yeah, I know. But he did appear to, maybe Anne or some of you can comment on that. He changed his floor plans, changed the plans repeatedly to reflect more modern ways of life.
No, he invented, along with Wright and all those other people at the turn of the century, the way in which we now look at residential architecture as being modern.
I was just thinking, I hate to say it, but I think he probably passed at the right time because going into the Depression and the advent of modernism, that could have killed him, really during the 30s. Would have been extremely difficult. Although I was really struck by the property that Bill showed in this neighborhood, I think it was on Calumet, with the rotating car garage. That building was starkly modern. It reminded me a little bit of Barry Byrne, like 20 years later. Really, really modern, but he seems to have strayed away from pushing that envelope. Well, not just the car.
The apartment, but to have that in a residence was
199 East Lakeshore Drive.
Yeah, but it seemed to me that he did evolve along with the times, very much. And I think he did have that modernist streak in some of his commercial buildings, which we really didn't have a chance to discuss as other industrial and commercial buildings. Bill, did you have any?
Ralph Shaw House that Ann mentioned a moment ago, he noted in his scrapbook that it was criticized. He knew it was avant-garde, it was criticized. That may have been a little bit of the reason why he kind of pushed back and didn't try it again. But I think also with an architect like Shaw, when you kind of do an analysis of the clients of Shaw, when they come to him to design a house, seeing what he has designed for others, I think they came with a certain expectation because they knew Shaw would design a certain type of house for them, even though he worked in more classical and arts and crafts and that sort of thing. So I think maybe he found that as the zone where his clients, that's what they actually wanted, and he would design what they wanted, obviously.
With fruit baskets.
With fruit baskets every single time, yes.
One of the fruit baskets. Lifestyles and floor plans have become much more open now, and I know, and there's a trend now for this sort of the see-through house where you can walk in the entrance and people want to see through to the backyard. And it was interesting that he did foresee a lot of that and brought a lot of that into his work. I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of Shaw buildings and the preservation of the building. It sounds like Market Square is doing okay and will be preserved, but Anne, did you notice, and Nate, we talked about this a little bit before, in a Frank Lloyd Wright house there are typical issues you have in almost any Wright building. Is there anything like that in Shaw, any particular restoration problems or issues that tend to come up? And there's a lot of relevance still in his buildings. We're in a building now that obviously the churches have a lot of relevance, but there's also that issue of do his homes become obsolete or other buildings?
I think Wright was always pushing the envelope, in particular the structural envelope, and that's why we run into some problems with Wright buildings. They were really almost experimental. I'd have to say about Shaw that he was a good technical architect. His buildings were well constructed, they were solid, with noble materials. If anything, I would say it's the stucco is always a problem, just because of the nature of stucco and the fact that we're in Chicago, as opposed to the Mediterranean. But I have...
How long does stucco tend to last?
Well, depending on what the substrate is. If it's a masonry substrate, like at Marktown, it can last quite a long time, but there's expansion and contraction issues with Portland cement-based stucco that it's going to crack. So, I don't know, 30 years maybe. Do you want to talk about Marktown in that?
So just touching on construction details, Marktown is a very well built community, has fireproof clay tile walls, and it does have a cement stucco exterior finish. So the preservation issues at Marktown are really less to do with the fitness of the buildings and more of political and external issues related to BP wanting the community to not exist and East Chicago not really upholding code standards for the housing.
Are there problems with modernizing the houses? And how do you adaptively reuse? Well, I guess buildings like the Mentor building, offices can be apartments, yeah. So many of those get turned in successfully into apartments, but what do you do with the industrial? Bill, what have you seen? How are the buildings being reused in the South Loop, the commercial industrial buildings?
Two things I want to mention. One is, the Lakeside Press building on Plymouth Court is a really interesting project of Shaw's because it was his first industrial building. He was, a very successful residential architect at that point, and so it was a stretch for him. It was new territory, but I'm mindful of that quote from his wife about how he loved to do everything himself. And so I thought, he was given that project and he had to figure out how to make that work. And what I love about it is, obviously a building for a printer has certain functional needs, and he has to have floor loads that work for printing presses and all that sort of thing. He's able to work all of that out and still create a building that's beautiful. So he's still working with his strength, which is how to create a beautiful structure. So as a result, even though that building has long since ceased to function in that way, it's still a beautiful building that contributes to the streetscape. So if it gets adaptively reused into residences or some other function, it still works very well from the exterior because it's simply a beautiful building. With the Donnelly plant over here on Calumet, which has been adaptively reused, it's now a tech center, so there's servers and all that sort of equipment. It was very easy to adapt because, again, it was built to accommodate huge printing presses, so the floors are incredibly thick and have incredibly heavy loads on them. So that was a very easy way to adapt that building. So some of those work. Now, the Gin & Company building, suffered greatly because it happened to be in a location where McCormick Place wanted to expand. So I didn't include a picture because it sends chills down my spine. But in the first preservation battle, what they actually did is they ran the ramp for a parking garage through the building. So I have this picture where you have the beautiful facade and you literally have this parking ramp going right behind it. And then in the second iteration, they actually take the facade down completely and rebuild it, and it now covers over a power station immediately south of the Donnelly plant. So I wouldn't necessarily consider that a great reuse of the building since only the facade survived, but it's actually interesting to now have it immediately next to Donnelly, and you have two really important Shaw buildings that have ended up right next to each other.
Kind of touching on kind of reuse of Shaw's buildings, I thought it was a really great quote about you want Addison to build your house for entertaining, but you want Shaw to build your house that you live in. And Shaw's houses are really comfortable. As a residential architect, I can tell you that the open plan is not as popular as it used to be, and we're really moving back towards separate spaces with flow between them. I think you see that in Shaw's, in Ragdale, for example, the living room sort of flows into the entry hall and flows into the dining room. And that really works today. I think the areas of the house that really you'd see the adaption, the small kitchens and servants areas, obviously those often, not just in Shaw's work, will get opened up into larger kitchens with adjacent sitting areas. But the houses as he designed them, I think, are still really livable and really comfortable.
a lot of the precepts of arts and crafts that he believed in have become popular again as kind of a retreat from minimalism, or at least in a different way. But, you know, where you have an emphasis now on authenticity, on handmade, the craftsmanship, and a lot of the things that you see here in the church, and that whole humanistic scale that is what Shaw did here in bringing down the roof line, where you have Gothic being shock and awe, and then you have arts and crafts being more about humanism and human scale. And I think a lot of that is coming back as well. I think we could take some questions from. Yes, sir. If you can speak loudly, and then we'll repeat the question. Or okay, Heather will give you the.
My question is about Marktown. I was down there several years ago with SIH, and the state of the community was pretty sad. The rental units apparently were falling into significant disrepair, but are there many owner-occupied houses still remaining?
Marktown,
Mark.
you do have, I don't think I would call it overcrowding. You do have long-term residents who live in Marktown and have lived there for a long time and really care about the community. I think some of the issues that you're seeing is that with the threat from BP and regional disinvestment in general, it's not easy to get a loan, you know, from equity in your house to make repairs or do things like that. So I think a lot of the problems in Marktown are more endemic of its location and this kind of industrial area, and then just sort of disinvestment in general in the cities around there.
I know that it was his childhood neighborhood, built 50 years, 7 years, goes on, and that went in.
Okay, the question is, did he comment on his buildings replacing other buildings replacing buildings, his buildings replacing other buildings? And he wrote very little. He spoke very little publicly. He did speak there's one speech he wrote that's in handwriting that says, if somebody builds a building that overpowers your house next door, you might as well shoot the owner.
There's your answer.
And we understand, and everything he wrote was criticism. He wrote about some AIA meetings where he was pretty critical. So I think he would have been very frank about those things. And the way partly I know that is working with Alice Hayes, who when was told in her garden that she should be bold and take out some of the arborvitae that were keeping sunlight out, she sat there quietly and then said, you can take those arborvitae out, and stood up and slammed the table and said, when I'm dead. So I think we know how he felt.
I think the other thing with that in this neighborhood, especially because of the transformation it underwent in the early 20th century, what we see is Shaw was very flexible. So, you know, 1899 to 1903, he's designing residences. He sees what happens to the neighborhood because his mom is still living here, and within a few years, he's designing industrial and commercial buildings. So I think he just saw it as part of the progression of being an architect, and that's what was happening to the neighborhood, and that's what was being required. It didn't matter that his mom's house was going to be in the shadow of the huge printing plant. That was what was happening to the neighborhood, and that's what he built.
As long as he was designing the new building as well. Right. So your answer is, I guess it was okay then.
And then just to add on to that real quickly, Shaw also designed homes for people who were leaving the neighborhood and leaving their old Shaw houses behind. Like the Starkweathers moved to Hyde Park and he built their new house, and they were obviously leaving the previous house that he had done for them. So he definitely had a hand in that kind of progression.
Someone mentioned the reuse of the Calumet Press building on Printers Row. A number of years ago, that was converted to condos, and now it's a dorm, or universities are using it for housing. And that was the last I heard of it, so I think it's been repurposed.
The building I mentioned is the one down here. The first one, the Lakeside Press building on Plymouth, is the one you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
The one I mentioned is the one here on Calumet, which has become the tech center.
And that's a wonderful repurpose for it. I
Yes.
know people that drive across from Michigan in for it to do work there, and people fly in to use that, so it's it's a good,
Yes.
good asset
Yes.
for them.
We're from Philadelphia, and we have ample supply of such houses. Only one by Shaw, but otherwise,
Thank you for being here.
I'm in the remodeling and building business, and our children and other children of the millennial age, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, they have ample money to do anything they want. They have absolutely no interest in the responsibility of living in a house like that, taking care of it, taking care of the grounds and so on. They would rather go to Paris for the weekend and come back to see something and just be unencumbered. And I wonder if that's going to affect the future ownership of these houses in any sensible way, no matter how little they are.
So I would just comment, being much older than you are, that things go in waves. And what happens is when they're out of fashion, people buy them, and then they get a good price, and then it comes back into fashion. So the good part is this is a great time to buy those big houses right now. And what mostly happens to them is they get renovated with a modern style write-in or reform back into the house. So the old servants' quarters is redone so that it's usable by a family. And so then what you end up having is something that's both livable and good for entertaining. And also some of these have been passed on to the next generation here local in Lake Forest up there where I am, passed on to the next generation, which is another good approach to having that happen.
I would just like to say, as we kind of bring this to a close, it's a nice opportunity to make a kind of a pitch for the importance of historic preservation education. As one or more of our speakers mentioned previously, Shaw buildings were very well built. So the ones that have been lost have not been lost because they fell apart. They were very functional, solid buildings. And one of the reasons we do things like today is to bring to light the fact that these buildings are very special. They bring special qualities to them. And of course, people's living patterns change over time. So, you know, an open plan that's popular when a house is built goes out of fashion, it comes back into fashion again. But, you know, it's important to say that when you have a house that is so carefully designed and built, it can be very easily used as a home. And so we hope that, you know, historic preservation plays a role in that and helps these buildings to survive, because, you know, what may be out of fashion in one decade, 20 years later is exactly what people are looking for. And if the building has been lost in the interim, you're never going to recreate a house that's like what Shaw built.
I think they can be used for modern uses. Like one of his things was to take the servants' quarters and turn it into a caretaker's apartment. And I think that's a popular thing now for either an in-laws apartment or a caretaker or a nanny's apartment. There are lots of ways of using these floor plans. We could maybe take one more question. Yes, Paul.
The two homes in Akron, Ohio, the Marks House, the last time I was there 30 years ago, it was a convent. And the workhouse over there, I don't remember the owner's first name, huge brick house, is owned by the Akron Women's Club, and it has been for decades. So sometimes the reuse of it, the alumni hall or the alumni building at the University of Chicago was a residence. It wasn't built as that, but the Alumni Association at the university has purchased it and turned it into their office. The Hilton building in Hyde Park is now owned by the university and the business school. So sometimes the repurpose is going to keep it up and going in the right direction.
Thank you, and we'll save conversations about the country clubs for another time, but are there, there's all of those, I mean, you designed so many different kinds of buildings. Are there any final remarks that any of you would like to make, Stuart? All right, well, we thank you all for coming and helping to celebrate Shaw's 150th birthday. Happy birthday, Alan. Thank you.